I'm live. Hi, guys. Welcome to Tangent Tuesday. This is something I do the second Tuesday of every month. My name is Joe. My channel is Fighting Words, the martial arts library. So, Tangent Tuesday is an opportunity for me to just sort of take any subject I want and just sort of riff on it. Before I really get into that, um, I I ordered a book, Karate Uchinadi by Itzik Cohen. And guys, it just came in the mail. I was not prepared for the thickness. So I'm I value every book that I have, every resource, you know. But as a guy who's, karate was my first martial art, it's still what I'm heavily invested in. Um, my cat's doing laps behind me. Um, so I'm excited for this. Again, I enjoy everything. There's some things I get really excited for, but it's going to have to take a back seat. It's over 500 pages. Um, but yeah, I got two books that I'm working through now, and one of my subscribers has requested that I do another book. So yeah, this is going to have to take a back seat for a while. Anyway, so the subject of tonight's Tangent Tuesday is how I miss the fact that we used to have such varied rules in the early days of mixed martial arts, primarily the 90s into the early 2000s. And of course, there are still some differences, like in North America or in the United States, you have the unified rules. And some organizations, I think Bellator, when they have their tournaments, will modify the unified rules so that they don't throw elbows to the head. Of course, another large organization, which is One Fighting, or is it One Championship? Um, they they have some different rules where, for instance, you are allowed to throw knees to the head of an opponent who's on the ground, but you are not allowed to do suplexes for some reason. Um, but what I really miss, what I'm getting all nostalgic for, is how back in the day, we used to have so many varied and separate rules. Like it was actually almost like having, three or four different but sort of related sports. So, obviously in the United States, you had the UFC, which, early on allowed for almost anything. There were no rules, excuse me, no weight classes. There were a few rules. Initially, it was, no biting and no eye gouging, and then they added weird rules like no pressure points, and that didn't last because nobody's, anyway. Um, Pressure points are probably not as potent as they are advertised sometimes. So there was no need to keep that rule around. Anyway, and you know, you can see in my thumbnail, you are also allowed to wear a variety of uniforms. So that the the photo in my thumbnail, which is Hoist Gracie versus Dan Severn squaring off, Hoist has got his traditional judo gi on, and I don't know if you can see it in the photo. Severn has got sort of high waisted pro wrestling style trunks, but he's also wearing wrestling shoes. Also at UFC 4, you had Melton Bowen, who was a boxing champion, like an intercontinental champion. He actually wore fingerless gloves in the UFC. He was the first guy to do that. And, in addition to his boxing shoes, I believe. Um, so, there were no weight classes. You had very few restrictions on what you could and couldn't do. There were no rules, or excuse me, I keep saying that, no rounds or time limits at the time. Um, and there was really no regulation as to what you could wear. There was a rule for a period of time where if you were wearing shoes, you couldn't throw kicks. Gradually, I know that they changed that because I remember seeing, it back in the early double digits UFCs. Mark Coleman lost to a guy named Pete Williams. Williams knocked him out with a kick, and I distinctly remember that Williams had wrestling shoes on. So that was sort of like the Wild West of martial arts at the time, of like that sort of fighting competition. Um, and even when there were these restrictions, there was no such thing as a disqualification. You got fined, so you could bite a guy and you could stick your thumb in his eye, and the ref wouldn't stop the fight. you would just you would just get fined however much it was. Now, on the other side of the Pacific, we had Japan, and the two organizations that stand out to me are Shuto and Pancrase. Now, Pancrase, I think, is much more famous during that period of time. Pancrase basically tried to be competitive professional wrestling. In fact, they called their format hybrid wrestling. So pro wrestling sort of has rules. Um, you know, being a work, the rules apply as much as the story calls for. But under pro wrestling rules, um, you were not technically allowed to punch the face, except in the WWE, they allow that all the time. Yeah, in North America, that's pretty much gone away, I think. But it used to be you couldn't throw a closed fist to the face. Well, in Pancrase, that was actually a legit rule. And, you know, you were restricted to throwing, palm strikes and open hand slaps. Boss Rudin, I think, at one point does like a spinning backhand to Frank Shamrock. One or the other did it. I think Boss was the guy who executed the move. So he like spun around and hit him with the back of his hand. You were very restricted in what you can do. Ground and pound wasn't banned, but there was sort of a gentleman's agreement not to do that between most of the fighters. It took place in a ring instead of a cage, and if you were put in a submission, you could grab the ropes, and your opponent would have to let go of the submission, just like in a pro wrestling match. Now there was a rule system that existed, like you couldn't do that indefinitely. You had a maximum of 5 chances of doing that. But again, contrast this with the UFC taking place literally in a steel cage, and guys like getting back mount on their opponent and just like pile driving their elbow into the guy's brainstem. Very different environment. And then also in Japan, you had Shuto. Shuto was incredibly close to modern MMA. They had rounds, they had weight classes. Among the rules were initially they had a standing 8 count rule. So if you got knocked down, the ref would give you a standing 8 count. Initially, ground and pound wasn't allowed. That wound up being changed. And by regulation, they wore fingerless gloves. The gloves in Shuto had a bit more padding than I think what you typically find in MMA gloves these days. But it was, with all those factors, it was incredibly close to modern MMA. And that's where we got like the smaller fighters of the time, like Hayato Sakurai, had Kao Luno was another big one, Rumina Sato, Genki Sudo, I think. A lot of these like lighter weight class fighters, really got going big in Japan in Shuto, because Pancrase didn't have weight classes. So like all those guys were like 180 pounds and up. And the other format you can contrast is Vale Tudo, straight out of Brazil. Now, without going into a big history lesson, I mean, I'm here for tangents, but come on. Basically, there used to be Vale Tudo fights, and then a guy got his arm broken on TV, and they called an end to it. With the UFC coming back, the UFC took the idea of Vale Tudo as a format. In Brazil, they had a similar rule set to the UFC. So like there were very few things you couldn't do. Um, and if you can see like some of Vanderlei Silva's fights, he likes being in the clinch and hitting people there. And in that environment, he was allowed to throw headbutts, which actually came out in one of his pride fights against Guy Mesger. And I think it was Steven Quadros who was like, "Oh, it's an accidental headbutt." Like, nah, like Silva reared back and smashed his head into his skull. That wasn't accidental. Um, but like the UFC, it was bare knuckle. Unlike Pancrase, you could totally punch with your bare knuckles. Um, they also took place in a ring most of the time. I think the World Vale Tudo Championship, yeah, WVC. They had a ring that had a net along the bottom of the ring so that people wouldn't slide out. Although I don't think they had that at early events because if I recall, there was at least one fight where a guy kept sliding out of the ring under the bottom rope, and eventually they just stopped the fight because like this guy doesn't want to be here. Okay, fine. Um, that's where you got guys like Mark Kerr, like I said, Vanderlei Silva started out there. Pele, I think, had some fights there. Chuck Liddell actually had one of his early fights in Vale Tudo. So, very similar to the UFC. One of the big differences is that the UFC was really pushing the whole style versus style thing in the beginning. So that's why they allowed the different participants to wear a uniform associated with their style. And Vale Tudo is like, all right, you guys get Speedos. That's it. That's your uniform. Which I guess being in the summer in Brazil, I can sort of understand why you would prefer to wear that instead of a gigantic, double weave judo gi. And then over in the Ukraine, they had a few fights, which is where guys like Igor Vovchanchin got started. And similarly, those took place in a cage. If I recall, that cage was larger than what the UFC was using. Again, no weight classes. Like Igor Vovchanchin, who was small enough to cut down to middleweight. I don't know if he ever did. He was a short, stocky guy, but he also had sort of that Northern European adipose issue. he looked a little bit chonky when he was fighting a heavyweight. So yeah, he could have potentially cut down to middleweight, I think, given his frame. He was going against Paul Verhoeven's, who was like 6'8" and like close to 300 pounds, maybe more. He was just like a huge dude, so you'd have like crazy matchups like that. And the reason I sort of miss these, I enjoy combat sports because we get many different variables involved. And we get to see how these different variables interact with one another. So, what comes out in a fight where you're not allowed to punch the guy in the head? What comes out in a fight where you're not allowed to wear gloves and protect your hands when you do want to punch? And actually, I got at least two instructionals. One is Ken Shamrock's first book, which I've already done a review of, and the other is Mario Sperry. One of his early instructionals was a tape on Vale Tudo. And it's interesting how both of these guys will incorporate bare knuckle punching. The idea that, okay, we know you're not going to be wearing gloves. So in this environment, this might be the best use of how to take advantage of this. it's very different from, other bare knuckle settings that we have, like, classical Western pugilism or things like Lethwei, where it's a competitive format where we get to see people hit each other bare knuckle all the time, or something like knockdown karate, like Kyokushin, where they're not allowed to punch in the face, but they also throw an awful lot of punches. So how do you adjust your style and your conditioning to deal with stuff like that? And does it contrast this with, like, you could be here for 20 minutes beating on this guy, so here's the best way to do damage if you don't have gloves to protect your hands. Just very interesting variables. And like with the pancrase, I think part of what we got from pancrase was a lot of chain wrestling, and I think a lot of that's probably the catch wrestling influence. But by the same token, there's also this necessity of, I can get this guy in a hold, but if he starts reaching toward the ropes, maybe I need to transition into something else, in order to control that limb, or to maybe cinch on something that has a better chance of making him say uncle before he gets there. So again, I find value in these different competitive sports formats. And, as a martial artist, part of martial arts, we always think of like warfare and self-defense, but, competitive martial arts, people fighting other people for pride or for money has been, a thing. Like, wrestling was probably the second sport ever invented after running. you know, um, there is value to be seen with things like this. And like I said, I just get nostalgic, and it's interesting. I got a collection of King of the Cage DVDs, and in some of the earlier ones, it's interesting to hear guys say stuff like, "Well, I've done some pancration matches, but I haven't done no holds barred yet." Basically saying I've done stuff like pancrase, but I haven't done stuff like the UFC yet. Oh man, I remember seeing in one of these, um, the cages were sort of thrown together. Like, there was no regulation for how to make a cage. So I got one of these old I think it's one of the old King of the Cage matches where, you know, there's no padding on the posts that are going around the cage. And, this one guy's in another guy's guard, and the guy's hanging on to him to keep him from hitting him. So the guy on top, like, walks over to the cage and, like, starts slamming the back of the guy's head on, the steel post that's supporting one of the corners of the cage. That's interesting. So yeah, I appreciate these formats for the inventiveness of the participants. Something that's a little bit gnarly to talk about. Like I said, in the Vale Tudo environment, it had very similar rules to the UFC, but one of the differences was everybody was in Speedos. So there's a fight Gary Goodridge is involved in. Goodridge was an old school, no holds barred UFC fighter. The other guy's a better grappler and is able to get on top of Goodridge. And then Goodridge has him in what's basically butterfly guard, but he's like putting his feet into the guy's trunks and like doing these short little kicks. And the ref is like, there's no rule against it. That's crazy. That is crazy by standards of modern competitive. I would say the competitive spirit of anything. Don't reach into a guy's trunks. I mean, like, Turkish oil wrestling notwithstanding, which is one martial art I will never try. That's just a little too personal, guys. But yeah, I long for the days where we had people who had to adjust to different rules, and the debate on, you know, whether this guy who specialized in this rule set would do well in this rule set. You know, there was a less dramatic difference, for instance, in the early aughts, the early 2000s, when people were talking about, Chuck Liddell versus Vanderlei Silva, when they were both champions of, the UFC and Pride, respectively. And one of the points of debate is, well, Vanderlei uses a lot of, kicks and knees to the head of a downed opponent. And that's against the UFC rules. If he finds himself in the UFC, is he going to be at a disadvantage because this is something he likes to do and something he will capitalize on? And then there was the difference between Pride's 10-minute first round versus the UFC only having 5-minute rounds. Would Vanderlei be fresher, or would Chuck be able to keep his cardio up for the full 10 minutes? And going into Pancrase, for instance, I think some of their main event fights were like 20 minutes nonstop. That's sort of a long time to fight. Most UFC fights during the early days barely got past, the 5-minute mark, unless, Ken Shamrock or Dan Severn happened to be involved. They had some boring fights around that time. Respect to both guys. Shamrock was one of my favorite guys when I was first getting into this stuff. Dan Severn has had just a gargantuan amount of fights, like going into his 40s. He finally retired not too long ago. But as far as like somebody watching the fights, they were not fun. One guy on top of another guy inside his guard, not trying to pass, not trying to go for submissions, and throwing these short, tiny punches and hammer fists, little headbutts that would like cut the guy open but not come close to actually finishing the fight because they didn't have Dr. Stoppage back then. You fought until the ref stopped it, or because you were unconscious or somebody threw in the towel. So they were very different environments. I miss the necessity for adaptability. These days, if you are getting into MMA, most places have adapted their rules to reflect the unified rules, even if it's overseas. I think there are some organizations in Brazil that still allow soccer kicks. Similarly, like I said, we got one championship, that their rules are different. I don't know how influential they are outside of their one organization, whether similar rules are popping up in other organizations in Asia. I'm sort of under the impression that that's not the case. If you know any different, please let me know. I think overall for the sport of MMA, it's better to have a unified system of rules. I will acknowledge that. But man, I miss the day when you could see Boss Rutan just like palm strike the hell out of a guy, and then a year later, have gloved fists and like throwing nonstop punches against Tsuyoshi Kosaka. Just it was fun, man. It was fun, and I miss it. But anyway, that's my nostalgic rant, and showing off my new toy, my 500-page toy. Soon, precious. Soon. Anyway, that's all I have for this week, and thank you for watching. And I'll see you guys on Friday with another video. Bye.